The night air was crisp, laced with the faint hum of city life. David Montgomery, dressed in a plain gray hoodie and jeans, drove through a quiet suburban neighborhood in his black sedan. The neighborhood was an unremarkable one, lined with tidy houses and well-manicured lawns. To an outsider, there was nothing out of the ordinary, but to David, this was home, a place tied to memories of family dinners and warm conversations with his mother. As he navigated the familiar streets, David allowed his mind to drift. It had been a long week in Washington, filled with meetings, briefings, and the constant tension that came with leading the nation's defense. Tonight, though, was different. He had decided to forego the usual motorcade and security detail. For once, he wanted to be just another son visiting his mother. The glow of his GPS guided him as he turned onto a quieter street. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearing 9 p.m. Almost there, he murmured to himself. Suddenly, the flash of red and blue lights pierced the darkness, and the wail of a siren shattered the serenity of the moment. David's stomach sank. He pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding with an unexpected anxiety. What could this be about? His car was in perfect condition, and he hadn't been speeding. The tall, white police officer approached his car, his flashlight cutting through the windshield like a blade. David rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel, a precaution he had learned long ago. "License and registration," the officer said, his tone cold and clipped. David complied without hesitation, reaching slowly for his wallet and glove compartment. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked calmly, trying to diffuse any tension. The officer, whose name tag read D. Wallace, scrutinized the documents before looking back at David. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His voice carried a sharp edge, laced with suspicion. David's brows furrowed. "I'm visiting family," he replied, keeping his tone measured. "My mother lives a few blocks away." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "You don't look like you belong around here. Step out of the vehicle." David hesitated, his pulse quickening. "Officer, I assure you, there's no need for." "Step out of the car," Wallace barked, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. The situation had escalated far too quickly, and David knew it. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, hands raised slightly. The beam of the flashlight was blinding, but what stung more was the familiar weight of judgment behind it. Under the harsh glow of the flashlight, David stood by his car, the cool night air biting at his skin. Wallace circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Do you have any drugs or weapons in the vehicle?" the officer demanded. David blinked, stunned by the question. "No, of course not. I'm a law-abiding citizen." "Let me be the judge of that," Wallace retorted, motioning for David to place his hands on the hood of the car. David hesitated for a moment, a flicker of defiance crossing his face. "Officer, I don't believe this is necessary. You've already seen my ID." Wallace stepped closer, his hand now firmly on the grip of his gun. "Are you resisting an officer of the law?" The word struck David like a slap. He sighed, his shoulders slumping, and complied. He placed his hands on the cool metal of the hood as Wallace began to pat him down. David's mind raced. This wasn't just about suspicion, it was about power, about proving dominance over someone Wallace had already judged as guilty. "Why are you so nervous?" "Huh? Got something to hide?" Wallace sneered, pulling out David's wallet and flipping through it without permission. David clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "I have nothing to hide. I'm nervous because I'm being treated like a criminal without cause." Wallace ignored him, moving to search the car. He rummaged through the glove compartment, the back seat, even the trunk. Finding nothing, he returned to David with a look of frustration. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" Wallace said, his tone dripping with venom. "Driving around here like you own the place." David turned his head slightly, meeting Wallace's gaze for the first time. "I don't think I'm smarter than anyone. I'm just trying to visit my mother." The response only seemed to infuriate Wallace further. Before David could react, Wallace grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice," the officer declared. The scene that followed unfolded like a nightmare. A small crowd began to gather. Drawn by the flashing lights and commotion, Wallace forced David to his knees on the sidewalk, the rough pavement scraping through the thin fabric of his jeans. A young woman in the crowd began recording on her phone. "What's he being arrested for?" she called out, her voice trembling with outrage. "Stay back," Wallace barked, waving her off. "This is police business." David, still kneeling, felt a deep sense of shame and helplessness. He knew the optics of this moment. To everyone watching, he was just another black man being subdued by the police, a story they had seen far too often. "This is unnecessary," David said, his voice firm but calm. "I've done nothing wrong." Wallace smirked, leaning down to whisper, "You people always think you're above the law." The words were a dagger to David's chest. He had spent his entire life proving his worth, overcoming barriers of prejudice, and serving his country at the highest level. And yet, here he was, reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of this man. The video captured every moment: Wallace's sneer, David's composure, and the palpable tension in the air. Within hours, it would ignite a firestorm. The cold, sterile walls of the police station were a stark contrast to the humiliation David had just endured. He sat silently in the holding cell, his wrists aching from the tight cuffs. Across from him, Wallace was filing paperwork, his smug expression betraying no hint of regret. "Can I make a phone call?" David asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Wallace shrugged. "Knock yourself out." David dialed a number from memory. Within minutes, a flurry of activity erupted. The station's captain burst into the room, his face pale as he stared at the man sitting calmly in the cell. "Release him immediately," the captain barked. Wallace looked up, confused. "What? Why?" "That's David Montgomery," the captain hissed. "The Secretary of Defense." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Wallace's smug demeanor crumbled, replaced by a dawning horror. He stammered, I didn't know." David stood as the cell door swung open, his expression unreadable. "You didn't care to know," he said quietly, his gaze piercing through Wallace. As David walked out of the station, now surrounded by aides and security personnel, he felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been judged, humiliated, or brutalized because of the color of their skin. But this time, he had the power to make a difference, and he intended to use it. The morning after the incident, the world had already seen the video. It started as a small spark on social media, a short clip uploaded by the young woman who had been part of the crowd the night before. The video began with David Montgomery kneeling on the pavement, handcuffed, his face a mask of calm amidst humiliation. In the background, Officer Daniel Wallace's voice rang out sharply, his tone authoritative and dripping with disdain. Within hours, the video had gone viral. Thousands of shares turned into millions, with hashtags like #JusticeForDavid and #StopRacialProfiling trending worldwide. But the most shocking revelation came later in the day. A prominent journalist, doing a routine fact-check on the video, pieced together the true identity of the man in the clip. Breaking. The man unlawfully arrested in the viral video is none other than David Montgomery, the U.S. Secretary of Defense. The news exploded like wildfire. Media outlets scrambled to cover the story, broadcasting the footage across the globe. Anchors and commentators dissected every second of the clip, raising questions about systemic racism and abuse of power. How could this happen to one of the most powerful men in the country? For David, the newfound attention was suffocating. He sat in his office at the Pentagon, watching the events unfold on the news. Calls flooded his phone: senators, governors, even the president himself. The latter's voice was grave when they spoke. "David, we need to address this head-on." The president said, "This is bigger than just you." David agreed, though his emotions were a tangled web of anger, exhaustion, and determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every black man and woman who had endured the same injustice without the privilege of a high-ranking title to protect them. David's decision to step forward publicly came quickly. The press conference was scheduled for the following afternoon, and every major news outlet was in attendance. The room was a sea of flashing cameras and murmuring voices as David approached the podium. He wore a dark suit, his posture rigid but composed. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "My name is David Montgomery, and I stand before you not as the Secretary of Defense, but as a man who has experienced firsthand the indignities of racial profiling." The room fell silent, the weight of his words cutting through the tension. David recounted the events of the night before, sparing no detail. He described the cold metal of the handcuffs, the harshness of the pavement, and the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype. "I am not here to vilify any individual," David continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But I cannot ignore the systemic issues that allow such incidents to occur. What happened to me is not an isolated event. It is a reflection of a deeper problem in our society, one that we must confront together." His words struck a chord. The next day, newspapers and news broadcasts were dominated by his speech. Some called him brave. Others criticized him for making the issue political. Regardless, the conversation had been ignited, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Daniel Wallace's world was crumbling. Suspended from duty pending an investigation, he spent his days trapped in his modest apartment, glued to the television. Every channel replayed the now infamous video. Every commentator dissected his actions, labeling him a racist and a disgrace. Daniel's anger boiled over as he threw the remote across the room. "They don't know me," he muttered bitterly. "They don't know what it's like out there." He thought back to his early days on the force, growing up in a working-class neighborhood. Daniel had joined the police academy with dreams of making a difference. But years on the job had hardened him. He had seen too much violence, too many tragedies. Somewhere along the way, he had started to believe the stereotypes, to see every black man as a potential threat. In his mind, he wasn't racist, he was realistic. But now, staring at the wreckage of his career, he began to question everything. Had he been wrong? Had his biases blinded him to the truth? Adding to his torment, his family was falling apart. His wife, unable to bear the public scrutiny, had taken their children to stay with her parents. "I need time to think," she had said before leaving. Alone and isolated, Daniel found himself spiraling into a dark place. The police department was under siege. Protesters gathered outside the precinct daily, their chants echoing through the streets. "Justice for David. End police brutality." Signs bearing slogans like "Black Lives Matter" and "No Justice, No Peace" filled the air with a sense of urgency. Inside, the atmosphere was no less tense. The Internal Affairs Division had launched a full-scale investigation into Daniel's conduct. Officers were interviewed, body cam footage was scrutinized, and Wallace's disciplinary record was laid bare. The findings were damning. Captain Harris, the precinct's commander, called a meeting to address the growing crisis. "This department is under a microscope," he said, his voice grave. "We've made mistakes, and now we have to own up to them." As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Daniel's actions weren't an isolated incident. Several other officers had filed complaints about his behavior in the past, complaints that had been quietly dismissed. The systemic failures of the department were laid bare, fueling the protesters' anger. For David, watching the investigation unfold was bittersweet. While he was glad to see accountability being pursued, he couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. How many others had suffered in silence? How many lives had been destroyed before someone finally decided to listen? For David Montgomery, the events of the past week stirred memories he had long buried. Sitting alone in his office late one evening, the shadows of the room seemed to whisper the stories of his past. His fingers traced the edges of an old photograph on his desk, a picture of his younger self with his parents. Standing outside their modest home, David closed his eyes, and the memories came flooding back. Growing up as a black child in a predominantly white neighborhood, he had faced his share of challenges. His father, a mechanic, and his mother, a schoolteacher, had always emphasized the importance of education and resilience. But no amount of preparation could shield him from the sting of racism. He remembered the first time he had been stopped by the police. He was 16, riding his bicycle home from a friend's house. The officers had accused him of stealing it, their hands resting on their weapons as they demanded proof of ownership. His protests had fallen on deaf ears, and it was only after his father arrived with the receipt that they let him go, without so much as an apology. That night, his father had sat him down and said, "David, you have to be twice as good, twice as careful, and twice as patient. The world will judge you before it knows you." Those words had shaped David's life. He had worked tirelessly to rise above the prejudice, excelling in school, joining the military, and eventually climbing the ranks to become Secretary of Defense. But even now, decades later, the scars of those experiences remained. David opened his eyes, his resolve hardening. He had endured too much to let this moment pass without making a difference. The fight wasn't just for him, it was for every black child riding their bicycle, wondering if they would make it home without being stopped. For Daniel Wallace, the days of suspension were a slow descent into chaos. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with the weight of his actions and their consequences. The public outcry showed no signs of abating, and the name Daniel Wallace had become synonymous with systemic racism. One evening, as he sat on his couch nursing a glass of whiskey, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old academy friend. "Turn on the news." Reluctantly, Daniel grabbed the remote and flipped to the channel. The screen displayed footage of a massive protest outside the police station. Thousands of people had gathered, their voices rising in unison. A reporter's voice cut through the chants. The protesters are demanding accountability and systemic reform in the wake of the viral video involving Officer Daniel Wallace and Secretary of Defense David Montgomery. Daniel's stomach churned. The reporter continued. Sources indicate that Wallace's disciplinary record includes multiple complaints of misconduct, raising questions about the department's oversight. He threw the remote down, anger surging through him. "They don't know the pressure I'm under," he shouted to the empty room. But deep down, another voice whispered, a quieter, more unsettling one. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I was wrong." That night, Daniel dreamed of his first day on the force. He had been young, idealistic, and eager to serve his community. But the years had changed him, hardening his heart and warping his perspective. He woke up drenched in sweat, the realization gnawing at him. Somewhere along the way, he had lost his way. The media frenzy had quieted slightly, but the conversation it had sparked showed no signs of dying down. In the midst of it all, David made a surprising decision. He wanted to meet Daniel Wallace. His advisors were skeptical. "Sir, with all due respect, what good could possibly come from this?" one of them asked during a meeting. David's response was firm. "This isn't about revenge or humiliation. It's about understanding. If we want real change, we have to address the root of the problem, and that starts with dialogue." Arrangements were made, and the meeting was scheduled in a neutral location, a small, private conference room in a government building. When Daniel arrived, escorted by his union representative, he looked visibly nervous. Gone was the arrogant officer from the video. In his place was a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. David entered the room with quiet authority. He extended a hand, which Daniel hesitated before shaking. They sat across from each other, the air thick with tension. David spoke first. "Officer Wallace, I requested this meeting because I believe there's a conversation we need to have, not just for us, but for the sake of our country." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, sir, I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job." David's gaze was steady. "But what if I hadn't been the Secretary of Defense? What if I had been an ordinary man, just trying to get home? Would you have treated me differently?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. David leaned forward. "I'm not here to destroy you, Officer Wallace, but I need you to understand the impact of your actions, not just on me, but on every person who looks like me. The system you're part of doesn't just need reform, it needs people like you to challenge it from within." Daniel listened, his defenses slowly crumbling. For the first time, he saw beyond his own perspective, glimpsing the pain and injustice his actions had caused. The conversation lasted hours, and though it ended on a cautious note, it was a start. Word of the meeting between David Montgomery and Daniel Wallace leaked to the press, sparking another wave of discussion. Some praised David for his willingness to engage in dialogue. Others criticized him for giving Wallace a platform. David remained unfazed. He knew that real change couldn't be achieved through anger alone. It required empathy, even for those who had caused harm. Meanwhile, the internal investigation into the police department concluded, and the findings were damning. Wallace was officially charged with misconduct, and several other officers were implicated in similar cases. The precinct was placed under federal oversight, with promises of sweeping reforms. But the ripple effects extended beyond the department. Inspired by David's speech and actions, grassroots movements sprang up across the country. Communities organized town halls, demanding accountability from their local police forces. Black activists and allies found renewed energy, their voices amplified by the momentum of the moment. For Daniel, the consequences were both professional and personal. He lost his job and faced criminal charges, but he also began to confront his biases. He enrolled in a restorative justice program, hoping to understand the harm he had caused and find a path forward. For David, the journey was far from over. He continued to advocate for systemic reform, using his platform to push for legislation and education. But he also made time to visit schools and community centers, speaking to young people about resilience, justice, and the power of change. The night of the meeting with Wallace still lingered in his mind. It wasn't a resolution, it was a beginning. The aftermath of David's meeting with Daniel rippled across the nation. The press had latched onto the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about race and justice in America. Some hailed David as a symbol of grace and leadership, a man who sought understanding instead of retribution. Others viewed his actions with skepticism, accusing him of being too lenient on an officer who had abused his power. Protests continued to grow, no longer confined to Daniel Wallace or the single police department at the center of the controversy. Across cities, towns, and rural areas, people took to the streets, demanding systemic change. Chants of justice for all and end police violence echoed through neighborhoods of every kind, with diverse crowds standing shoulder to shoulder. Yet, the nation remained deeply divided. On cable news, pundits argued over the implications of the case. Conservative commentators painted Daniel as a scapegoat, a victim of cancel culture. Liberal voices called for sweeping reforms and pointed to David's experience as proof of a broken system. Social media was a battleground of opinions, with hashtags supporting and condemning both men trending simultaneously. For David, the noise was deafening. Sitting in his office one evening, he turned off the television and stared at the blank wall. Despite his public composure, the weight of the past weeks pressed heavily on him. The debate, the protests, and the political maneuvering all seemed to detract from the simple truth he had been trying to convey. This wasn't just about one man or one incident. It was about the countless lives affected by systemic inequality. Taking a deep breath, David resolved to shift the narrative. He began drafting a plan, a series of initiatives to push for tangible, legislative change. This wasn't just about dialogue anymore. It was about action. David's proposal was unveiled at a press conference, held in the heart of Washington, D.C. The room was packed with reporters, activists, and policymakers. Behind him stood a diverse coalition of allies, including lawmakers, community leaders, and even a few progressive police officers who supported reform. He stepped to the podium, his voice steady and resonant. The events of the past few weeks have laid bare what many of us have known for far too long. Our justice system is in dire need of change. But change cannot come from outrage alone. It requires commitment, courage, and cooperation. David outlined a comprehensive reform plan, which he called the Justice and Accountability Act. The proposal included mandatory anti-bias training for all law enforcement officers, independent oversight committees to investigate allegations of police misconduct, the establishment of a national database to track officers with a history of complaints or disciplinary actions, increased funding for community policing initiatives aimed at fostering trust between officers and residents. The room erupted in applause as David finished his speech. But he knew the battle was just beginning. Passing the legislation would require navigating a deeply divided Congress, where partisan interests often overshadowed the common good. Behind the scenes, David worked tirelessly, meeting with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Some were supportive, while others resisted, claiming the reforms were an attack on law enforcement. Despite the resistance, David remained undeterred, determined to see the plan through. For Daniel Wallace, life had become a series of reckonings. Removed from the police force, he found himself in a restorative justice program, attending sessions designed to confront biases and foster empathy. First, Daniel had been skeptical, dismissing the program as little more than a political charade. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. In one session, Daniel sat in a circle with a group of participants, people from diverse backgrounds who had experienced injustice firsthand. One woman, an elderly black grandmother named Harriet, shared a story that shook him to his core. "I raised my grandson to be respectful, to follow the rules," Harriet said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But 3 years ago, he was stopped by the police on his way home from work. They said he matched a suspect's description. He ended up in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Took us months to prove his innocence. And even now, he struggles to move on. All because someone assumed he was guilty just by looking at him." Harriet's story stayed with Daniel long after the session ended. He began to see his actions in a new light, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern of harm. Slowly, he started taking accountability, not just in words but in actions. He reached out to community leaders, asking how he could support their efforts for change. One day, he wrote a letter to David Montgomery. In it, he expressed regret, not just for the incident, but for the years of bias that had clouded his judgment. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only the opportunity to learn from his mistakes. The first signs of tangible change began to appear. In communities across the country, police departments started implementing new policies inspired by David's reform plan. Officers attended workshops on cultural competency and de-escalation techniques. Oversight committees began reviewing misconduct cases with a level of scrutiny that had long been absent. In one town, a group of officers partnered with local activists to organize a community event, where residents could voice their concerns directly. The event was tense at first, but as conversations unfolded, both sides began to find common ground. One officer, a young recruit, summed it up best: "We're not just here to enforce the law, we're here to serve the people." Meanwhile, the Justice and Accountability Act made its way through Congress. The debates were fierce, with opponents accusing the bill of being anti-police. But David's testimony before a congressional committee turned the tide. Speaking with conviction, he reminded lawmakers of their responsibility to uphold justice for all citizens, not just a select few. We cannot allow fear or complacency to dictate our actions, David said in his closing remarks. The time for change is now, not for me, not for you, but for the generations that will inherit the world we create. The bill passed the House by a narrow margin, and the Senate vote loomed. Activists rallied across the nation, urging their representatives to support the legislation. On the day of the vote, David stood outside the Capitol, surrounded by a crowd of supporters, waiting anxiously for the results. When the news came, it was historic. The Justice and Accountability Act had passed, marking a major step toward systemic reform. The air in Washington, D.C., was electric with anticipation. The Justice and Accountability Act, after weeks of intense debate, had finally reached the Senate floor for a vote. Activists gathered outside the Capitol, holding signs and chanting for change. Inside, the atmosphere was no less charged. David Montgomery sat in the gallery, his presence a silent reminder of what was at stake. Around him, reporters whispered updates into their phones, capturing every moment of the historic event. As the roll call began, David's heart raced. Each I felt like a step forward, while every nay tightened the knot in his stomach. The vote was expected to be razor-thin, with moderate senators on both sides of the aisle holding the balance of power. Senator Eleanor Hayes, a longtime ally of David's, was one of the last to speak. Rising from her seat, she addressed the chamber with a voice that carried both determination and empathy. "This bill is not perfect," she began, "but perfection cannot be the enemy of progress. Tonight, we have the opportunity to take a meaningful step toward justice and accountability. Let us not squander it." Her words swayed several undecided senators, tipping the scales. When the final vote was tallied, the result was clear. The Justice and Accountability Act had passed. Cheers erupted in the gallery and outside the Capitol. David closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. But he knew this was just the beginning. Passing the law was one thing, implementing it would be another battle entirely. In the weeks following the bill's passage, David received an unexpected request. Daniel Wallace wanted to meet with him again, not in a public forum, but privately. After much consideration, David agreed. He wanted to hear what Daniel had to say, and perhaps offer closure to a chapter that had consumed both their lives. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at a community center. Daniel arrived first, looking markedly different from their previous encounter. He had lost weight, his posture was less rigid, and his eyes carried a hint of humility that hadn't been there before. When David entered, the room seemed to shrink with the weight of their shared history. They shook hands briefly before sitting across from each other, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Daniel spoke first, his voice tinged with regret. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry for everything, not just for what happened that night, but for the way I let my biases dictate my actions for so many years." David studied him carefully, searching for sincerity. "What changed?" he asked. Daniel hesitated, then began to explain. He talked about the restorative justice program, the stories he had heard, and the reflection it had forced him to do. "I used to think I was just doing my job," he admitted. "But I see now that I was part of the problem. I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment, and I hurt people because of it." For a moment, David didn't respond. Then he said, "Acknowledging that is a start. But redemption isn't about words. It's about actions. What are you doing to make things right?" Daniel nodded, expecting the challenge. He described his efforts to work with local community groups, his participation in anti-bias training workshops, and his commitment to speaking out against the very attitudes he once harbored. Their conversation lasted hours, and by the end, there was no forgiveness, at least not in the traditional sense. But there was understanding, and for both men, that was enough. The passage of the Justice and Accountability Act marked the beginning of a new era. But it was far from a quick fix. Across the country, police departments faced the monumental task of implementing the reforms mandated by the law. Some embraced the changes, while others resisted. Clinging to the old ways, David threw himself into the work, traveling to cities and towns to meet with community leaders, police chiefs, and activists. He delivered speeches, participated in workshops, and lent his voice to the ongoing fight for equity. His presence inspired hope and accountability. But he also made it clear that the real work had to come from within each community. In one small town in the Midwest, a police chief named Carla Rivera stood at the forefront of change. She invited David to speak at a town hall meeting, where officers and residents could come together to discuss their concerns. The event was tense at first, with decades of mistrust simmering beneath the surface. But as the conversation unfolded, something remarkable happened. People began to listen. An elderly black man shared his experience of being stopped and frisked multiple times in his own neighborhood. A young officer, visibly moved, apologized and promised to do better. By the end of the night, there was no sweeping resolution, but there was a beginning, a fragile but real connection. Stories like these became increasingly common. In some places, the reforms sparked genuine transformation. In others, they faced resistance. But even there, the seeds of change had been planted. Years passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. But the events of that fateful night, and everything that followed, left an indelible mark on the nation. David Montgomery continued his work, balancing his duties as Secretary of Defense with his advocacy for justice and equity. His speeches became legendary, not because of their eloquence, but because of their authenticity. On the anniversary of the Justice and Accountability Act's passage, a large gathering was held on the National Mall. Tens of thousands of people attended, representing every race, background, and walk of life. The event was both a celebration of progress and a reminder of the work still to be done. David stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. Among them, he spotted familiar ones: Carla Rivera, the police chief who had become a national leader in reform; Harriet, the grandmother whose story had touched so many; and even Daniel Wallace, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. When David stepped to the microphone, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. Tonight, we celebrate not just a law, but a movement fueled by pain, resilience, and the unwavering belief that we can be better. He paused, letting the words settle. But let us remember, progress is not a destination. It is a journey, and that journey belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising together as one. For David, it was a moment of profound clarity. The fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, real, tangible hope. As the event came to an end, David stood alone for a moment, watching the crowd disperse. The National Mall, once the site of so much division and struggle, now felt like sacred ground, a place where a new chapter of the nation's story had begun. And with that, David turned and walked away, ready for whatever came next.